Three, two, one. Into the Absurd, episode number 23, with Stephen Umbrello, the managing director at the Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He is also pursuing a doctorate in the ethics and design of AI at the University of Turin, Italy. Thanks for coming on.
No problem, brother. Thanks for inviting me.
So how'd you get into philosophy?
Oh, wow. We're going to go really far back then. So I think it was, I'm sure it was back in high school. I was originally pursuing mathematics because I think my main goal, as my teachers at the time were focusing me on, was pursue math to the fullest degree, given that my original aspiration was actually to enlist in the Canadian Air Force, because I'm originally Canadian, although I'm studying here in Italy right now. So because mathematics is obviously one of the primary subjects of study to even be considered in the Air Force, I was pursuing mostly that with a focus more on studies of space, so cosmology and physics. Then, because I went actually to a religious high school, a Roman Catholic high school, every year we were required to take religion. So it's a obligatory requisite. However, in grade 12, the final year of high school, they gave the option. So it was either religion or philosophy. And I remember everybody, no, don't take philosophy. Don't take it. It's hard. Take a bird course, take religion. Religion was always a bird course, as we would say. So super easy, just fly by, get the good marks, get into university. And I'm like, you know what? No, I want to change it up a bit. I want to try something new. So despite everybody saying how difficult it was, I think it was the most impactful, most fun course I took. We read, we started off with the pre-Socratics into the Socratics. So we read Sophie's World, which is kind of like a common thing. And then when I taught high school at a private high school, while I was doing my master's degree, I kind of took that curriculum from grade 12 that I remembered, and I was teaching those high school students the same things that I learned, because that's what influenced me the most. That moment, that course there was kind of what switched my career. The moment I went into university, it was like, no, I'm going full on philosophy. I also minored in classical civilization, so Roman and Greek history. But it was really that formative choice there in high school where I was like, no, philosophy is something that just changed everything.
Yeah, that's how I feel about philosophy. It's kind of a way towards a spiritual path without religion, really, or at least it's also a way of analyzing the world objectively. It helps you do that, and it's just fun. I mean, I think all humans are philosophers by nature.
Especially as children.
Yes,
Which
for
is
sure.
kind of beaten out of you. It seems dogma and ideology is usually what kind of breeds that natural curiosity out of people, right? Because what is ideology other than knowing the answer before the question is asked, right? Which is the very opposite of what philosophy tries to teach you. One of the things that always surprised me was, after taking that first course in philosophy in grade 12, was when I was in university, is every time I took, particularly epistemology, because I was trained in the analytic tradition, and then I came into the continental tradition of philosophy later during my master's degrees, was every time I took an epistemology classes, I came out knowing less than when I went in, which is the opposite of what I originally thought I was going to be getting into when it came to philosophy. It's like, wow, I literally know nothing. And it was like that very Socratic notion. Every argument, every paper that they made us read, it seemed like I was very convinced by the author's argument, and then it was followed up directly with a counter argument that seemed as equally as convincing. And that kind of, I guess, is the whole point. It was like training. That's where the critical element comes from. It's the self-realization, right? You're reading something, you become convinced by either the structure of the argument, the prose that the author uses, and then it's immediately followed up by a similarly convincing argument that is exactly counter to the other one you've read. So it's like this constant, I guess you could say, testing of the waters, right? That Socratic notion that philosophy is kind of like it's not the filling of a cup, but it's like the burning of a fire. You're burning away all your preconceptions, and in the end, you're really left with nothing. And by nothing, it's the open mind, right? So you're open to all these points of view. And that's pretty much what I've gotten out of philosophy. And it hasn't really changed since. I still think I don't really know that much. The more I read, you would think the more you would know. It's the less you know. So many new points of view and arguments that you couldn't even have conceived of.
Well, you're learning about what you don't know, right? You're not learning answers, you're learning questions to ask, right?
Well, that philosophy, it's fundamental, getting it confused with the love of knowledge. It's not really that, it's the love of wisdom, which is not knowledge, right? It's not the attainment of knowledge. It's the very opposite of that, right?
Yes. So you were interested in mathematics, and that's probably how you got into ethics of technology, right?
Actually, no. So maybe ancillary, maybe. Um, I did excel in logic, which you can see the parallels obviously between mathematics and like propositional calculus and so on, right? But by actually studying that, I became more disinterested in it.
Hmm.
Over time, I actually became more disinterested in the analytic tradition, which I still am in. I still consider myself mostly firm within the analytic tradition, but then again, that's what I was trained in for all those years, particularly coming from the West, right? North America, the British tradition of philosophy. The ethics of technology. So I went to the University of Toronto. That's where I earned my undergraduate degree in philosophy and classical studies. And while I was there, despite everything being analytic, I started to kind of branch out on my own, right? Started reading books like the works of Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. But I came across a MOOC, massive online course, from Delft University, and it was on responsible innovation and the ethics of technology, just by chance. And I go, that's really interesting, because while I was at U of T, I was studying also philosophy of science, right? Because I was always interested in sciences, in physics, and particularly, like I said, while I was in high school. So I kind of saw this trend, I guess you could say parallels between the philosophy of science and then the philosophy of technology, right? And because I was always really interested in ethics primarily during my studies of philosophy, because I like the idea of a practical use of philosophy.
Hmm.
Now, there's a distinction I do have to make when we talk about philosophy. I really do think philosophy is less of an academic practice and more of a lived practice, right? So I do follow, I guess you could say, or I strive to follow in the footsteps of people like Marcus Aurelius, right? Or the Stoic philosophers, which is philosophy is fundamentally something you do every day, the way you treat other people, the way you respond, the way you treat yourself. I think that's fundamentally where philosophy manifests itself most powerfully, rather than in just dry academic texts.
Yeah, philosophy
Um,
is a way of life, not simply something that you're interested in.
Yeah, and that's kind of what shifted my focus away somewhat from the analytic tradition, because I found, particularly in ethics, I never liked this reductionist moral law theory view of ethics, that ethics can simply be written down on a piece of paper as a set of rules or commandments, really. But ethics is kind of, it uncovers itself, it manifests itself, and it develops in our interactions with each other, with the natural world, right? It's heavily contextual based, right? You can't simply, a trolley problem is exactly not ethics, right? Because it's prototypical. It doesn't take into account every contextual factor, which is fundamentally what
Hmm.
determines what we consider to be ethical actions. And when I discovered that MOOC in particular, and my interest in science and therefore also in technology, things like artificial intelligence and nanotechnology, I've always been interested in science fiction, for example. It really drew me to it, particularly because the Delft tradition, the University of Delft, the Technical University of Delft, which is really, you could say, the hub, the nexus, the center of the ethics and philosophy of technology, has this very hybridized approach. They're not so dogmatic. It's not like we're sticking with the analytic tradition. No, they're very open that way. And when I took that MOOC, I kind of like shifted gears entirely. I'm like, okay, I see not only interest here, but I see real practical applications, day-to-day work that can be done of putting philosophy into practice, which is essentially philosophy itself, philosophy proper. It's philosophy in practice, right? This lifestyle you're saying is how can we, every technology is fundamentally value laden, right? Whether we want it or not. And we can discuss that if you like. Uh, and because of that, I see that it's the perfect place where we can actually start putting these principles into practices or this lifestyle into practice and making some sort of beneficial changes.
So, what do you mean by technology being value? Do you say value ridden?
Value laden. So same
Value
thing.
laden.
Value. Yeah. So they're embedded or they embody value. So here's a good example. It's probably best to describe it via example. So one of the most famous examples, and this is kind of what marks what philosophers of technology or ethicists of technology call today, is called the applied turn in, or sorry, the design turn in applied ethics, right? So there's a long tradition of applied ethics, and now there's this design turn. That design is the entry point of how we can actually put applied ethics into practice in regards to technology. So the point was really in 1980. So Langdon Winner, professor of philosophy, he looked at the bridges, these low-lying overpasses that surround Long Island, New York. Okay, and the architect back in the 1920s who designed these bridges designed them purposefully low, low enough where buses could not pass underneath them. And this was done on purpose. Why? Because he wanted to protect, in quotes, his favorite beaches on Long Island, New York, from the African American and minority communities who, during the 1920s, would be taking public transit and not cars that could pass underneath. He designed that, what you would call perhaps a very simplistic or low tech version, technology, a bridge, with a certain value in mind. In this case, what we would consider a perhaps recalcitrant value, so that of racist values, his values, right? Because he didn't want the minority communities to infest his most prized beaches. So he designed them in such a way as to, through infrastructure, through the architecture of the technology itself, to embody this value. Now, of course, values also change over time, just as technologies change over time. As the vehicle, automobile became more affordable, even those people of those communities that were once unable to access those beaches were now able to access those beaches, despite the technology physically remaining the same. The height has not changed. So, depending also on society and on the technology itself, there's this kind of dance, what we would call the interactional stance on technology. Technologies don't purely determine society, and society does not purely determine technology, nor is technology purely instrumental, meaning it's not just a neutral tool that we decide how it can be used. It has that aspect, it has all of these aspects, right? So, whether or not we like it, whether or not a designer tries to intentionally or unintentionally design a value into a technology, the technology remains nonetheless value laden with whatever those values may be. And we're seeing that more and more today, particularly with artificial intelligence, even when designers are not explicitly trying to design a technology with a certain value, we still see things like biases and so on in the data sets, right? Without this explicit orientation towards designing for values. So that's fundamentally what it means for a technology to embody a value.
That's interesting and dark in some areas. I know there's some police technologies that are used to identify and convict people of a crime with artificial intelligence, but with the data that's used, it's biased towards African Americans, right?
We see a lot of that kind of bias, don't we?
Mhm.
I can't remember the exact system, but Google was developing a facial recognition system that can categorize certain faces, right? And unfortunately, within the earlier versions, and I believe it later was scuttled, that it categorized African American males and certain females as gorillas, That's what it categorized them as, right?
Mm.
So you can see that's a function of bias, maybe not only in the data set, but in the training of the artificial intelligence, if it was using supervised or unsupervised training. You can have bias across the entire development spectrum of any technology, right? And we see this most manifest in artificial intelligence. And that's mostly because, and this of course goes for many technologies, but perhaps most explicitly for AI, is that we don't really know what it'll do until we actually put it out there. So there's this
Mm.
weird opportunity cost when it comes with artificial intelligence, particularly those which function on things like machine learning, which tend to be opaque, right? It's black boxed, we like to say. And that's because they're so complex. The decision making logic is so complex that we can program it to do this now, but its self-learning capabilities over time may lead it into directions that are unforeseen or even unforeseeable. And that makes it quite scary. And of course, potentially dangerous depending on what applications we want to employ artificial intelligence systems like this.
Hmm. Yeah, I think part of the problem is that we have, well, the data that we have is already biased, right?
Yeah, it's just by collecting the data, right? So, like I said, even the earliest phases is before we even conceive of let's build an AI, right? And like here are the data sets. It's like, but how were those data sets even collected in the first place, right? We have, it's fundamentally, it's hard to even call an AI system biased itself. It's kind of, it's always human bias somewhere, right?
Mm.
It's human bias throughout the entire design program. It's which humans were the ones collecting the data? How do they collect the data? How do they tag the data? How do they categorize the data? Why do they choose certain categories over others? Did they not think of certain categories over others? Did some come at an opportunity cost of others? Complexity, time costs. There's the real like economic values that also come into play when it comes to businesses. We know that most of these extremely powerful AI systems are built in the private sphere, of course, right, where most innovation takes place. So there's also the economic values that are often construed as coming into conflict with what perhaps we would call moral values, right? My argument or my research over the last few years has been that these are fundamentally not do not come at the opportunity cost of one another, but can and should be complementary with one another. That economic value should not come at the opportunity cost of moral values and vice versa.
Hmm. I definitely agree with that. It's, I know with social media, for instance, with all the algorithms, essentially getting people to stay as interested as possible for as long as possible, which is usually helped with the emotion of anger, right? Anger keeps you really hooked, you know, but so does curiosity, at least. I mean, if you're looking for angry stuff, they're going to keep sending you angry stuff because that's just what the algorithm does. If you look for positive stuff all the time, they'll keep sending you positive stuff.
Yeah,
So,
these type of recommender systems are pretty powerful, and they
yeah.
kind of silo us, right? They put us into this into a bubble, kind of
Mhm.
our own creation, right? And they reinforce certain patterns of behaviors that we display online, right? They keep providing us with this recommended content.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's obviously for an an economic purpose, right?
Oh well, yeah, definitely. I don't see or I haven't seen, and I don't expect to see any type of true altruism coming from these types of companies, despite their marketing of why they're using these recommender systems. At the bottom line, there's the bottom line, right? And the bottom line is green, right? It's money, and this is obviously working for them, and we can see why. And there's entire courses for those people who are learning to build AI. Now, of course, recommender systems in and of themselves are not immoral, you can say, right? They're not evil. Um, Now, the way they're designed for the implementation, for the context of their use, right? we can say are probably somewhat deleterious to society. What you kind of brought up, which is the effect of the recommender systems, right, is what perhaps Nolan Gertz at University of Twente in the Netherlands would call technological nihilism, right? They kind of reinforce this technological nihilism, this meaningless obsession, this constant checking, the notifications that constantly draw our attention. None of that is by accident. You have psychologists that are behind, that are working with these companies to try to find out, the exact milliseconds, the exact look, the sounds, the vibration, all that haptic feedback that plays on some of our most basest and evolved fight or flight responses, right? The dopamine system, right? The parasympathetic nervous system. All these little tricks, these heuristics that these large enterprises are using to draw our attention, of course, for them is towards a single end, constant use of their platform or service towards ever greater profits. And remember, everyone says, of course, it is a choice to use these types of technologies, of course, despite the fact that they're designed to capture and to hold people's attention. And yes, most people think they're free, but when you think it's free and when it doesn't cost you anything, it's usually because you're the product, right? And that's fundamentally what's happened is your data, right? Your online personality, your on life personality, that's the product that's being sold.
It's like they're fishing.
That fishing, but the bait is obviously the platform, but we willingly bite onto it, right? And we happily stay on it. When the hook grabs you, we're perfectly happy to stay on the hook, right? It's not painful enough.
No, it's not. Do you have any suggestions on maybe fixing it? Like, say, if they were to make it so they would send you something completely the opposite of what you would look into, do you think that would work?
So the thing, okay, so there's many levels of abstraction when it comes to what you say, how can we fix this? How can we remedy this? So of course there's the technical side. It's like, how can we make this like I said, the recommender systems are not inherently bad, right? We can also reinforce good behavior through these type of recommender systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not their intention in the use and the implementation of these systems. I'm a little bit more pessimistic in terms of will we actually do this? Unlikely. And like I said, there's multiple levels of abstraction. Big, you could say Silicon Valley and big tech has fundamentally become one of the largest lobbyists, particularly in the West. And their political influence kind of has stabilized their position. The once and still unholy alliance that we call the military industrial complex is kind of now paralleled with big tech when it comes to politics also. So you have that kind of entrenched, calcified neoliberalism, right? This constant corporatism at the top that reinforces what happens at the bottom. And it's a matter of policy also. They protect themselves through their lobbying, right? And then therefore, even their most base level practices, which is the development and implementation of these kinds of systems. Are we going to change this? Unlikely. Is it going to get worse? Yeah, probably. Probably going to keep getting worse. There's no indication that it will get better. We're, being part of the AI ethics community, whatever you want to call that, which is growing, but it's mostly charlatans and mostly ethics washing that we would call. Many companies you see, like, we're going to hire AI ethicists, right? And then Google fires 2 of them in a few months, the moment they speak up or do something that could even be remotely threatening to their bottom line. So what's the purpose of having this? Is just to whitewash, right? Just like we're thinking about responsibly innovating here, but the moment they say anything that may go against us, they kick them out, right? So this growing group of AI ethicists or ethicists in tech, I think most of the people who get into it have really good intentions, and I think even probably while they're in it, continue to have good intentions, but they're fighting against the machine in a certain way, and the machine doesn't really fight back. They just get rid of you, right? And Google's a really good example of that, right? I don't know why they bothered getting rid of the "Don't be evil" slogan. I guess maybe they're that self-aware, so they got rid of it. There's no need to hide that.
I guess the only solution really is throwing your phone into the lake or something.
Well, here in Europe, I've seen over the last few years this really huge trend of having two phones, having a smartphone, which is for home use and it does not leave the home, and a flip phone, one of those old-fashioned flip phones, burner phones, right? Things you see mobsters and criminals often associated with in the movies using, walking around with. It's funny how it was actually shocking to me that people do that here. Here in Italy, I see it all the time. People always have two or more phones, right? Their smartphone they kind of keep, or they keep it at home. They're very well aware of the privacy issues, and despite some United States officials, you could say, poking fun at Europe, calling privacy the European religion in a derogatory way, as if that's a negative, saying that we worship privacy. It's probably because of the GDPR over here. I found it like quite refreshing to see that. Coming from North America, it seems that when it comes to our willing and voluntary abdication of privacy rights, it seems that we do it there, despite all the talk, quite nonchalantly. Whereas over here, at least with my limited experience here in Italy and going to Germany also, it seems that it's being put more into practice, taken a little bit more seriously. They're aware of the privacy issues, and what we all know after Edward Snowden, the scope of what is happening with our technologies. I remember when TikTok came out, everybody's freaking out, Chinese spyware, right? Chinese spyware. It's like, we got to ban it. It's like, well, if we're going to ban the Chinese spyware, why don't we ban the American spyware, right? Facebook and Twitter, that's American spyware. Well, why do you care if the Chinese are spying on you? You don't care that maybe it's I like my country spying on me. That's great, right? I love my country spying on me, but I don't want the Chinese spying on me, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's I don't know if you saw the Snowden movie.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, it was good, and also watched part of the Joe Rogan Snowden interview, which is interesting because he said that the only way to essentially have it so the government can't listen to you is by taking out your battery from your phone.
It seems that, yeah. The thing is, did you notice how many phones are designed now? How do you take a battery out of your iPhone, right? It's
You
slightly
can't.
inconvenient.
It's hard.
You can, right? So you got that little thing into the design. You see, that's not by accident. Before really the iPhone came into play, most phones, and many phones still do, allow you to remove the battery, right? And you can change them
Easily.
out really easily, very easy. Slip the back off, right? Just one swipe, you can take the battery up, swipe it out. I still remember that. Had multiple batteries, right? You don't want to wait for it to charge, slap another one in. And they were relatively low cost also. So it was actually quite efficient. Kind of forgot that practice, haven't we, over time? It's become normalized, the fact that batteries are solid state. You can't take them out of the phones. They're part of the hardware. You want to change, it costs a fortune if you're unable to do it yourself.
People are also more careful about dropping their phone in water these days.
Definitely more careful. I'm very, very careful after learning the lesson the hard way, right?
Yeah.
In the most unlikely scenario, it's like Murphy's Law, right? It's like it's impossible. It'll never drop. You walk over the only puddle in the city, somehow the phone manages to drop right in that one spot. So
Yeah, when I was younger, I used to drop the flip phones in water all the time. And you'd soak it in rice and everything. But today,
somehow
yeah,
they
I
still
mean,
work.
yeah, and the phones are $700, $800, $1,000 now. So
Yeah, even more, man. You get the higher storage in an iPhone, and despite the, you could say marginal, but it's fundamentally quite expensive in the end. The costs, how they've increased over the years, you will still have lineups days before a phone's release of people outside willing to pay happily that the cost, right?
mhm.
Despite marginal increases in what you would call processing speeds, right? Storage capacities, the features fundamentally are not revolutionary. It's small leaps, if you would even call them leaps, steps.
So have you read 1984 and Brave New World?
I've read both of them by force in high school. They were obligatory. I think, given particularly after Edward Snowden and after continuing with what they're doing to Julian Assange, which is criminal, um, George Orwell would be rolling in his grave. I don't even think he could have imagined that we have a telescreen. We willingly pay essentially to have one of his telescreens in our pocket at all times listening to us. We paid for it. It wasn't forced on us. We paid for it. And we're willing to pay more for it next year. So I don't think he could have managed that. Yes, Tesla at one time predicted that we would have these amazing technologies. And George Orwell followed up by saying, that maybe in the future, this totalitarian regime with sufficiently advanced technology would be able to be truly totalitarian beyond the horrors that we saw in the East, in the Gulag Archipelago, or even in Germany, right? We're seeing it now in this kind of soft totalitarianism. Some people knew it was going on. Even politicians knew it was going on, but not exactly. And then when Snowden came out and told us exactly the scope, the quantity, the mass amounts of data that are beyond any single person's ability to compute, right? George Orwell couldn't have possibly fathomed that amount, just the quantity of information that's being taken from every single citizen.
Hmm. Yeah, I like what you said, soft totalitarianism.
Yeah, you're not seeing too many jackboot thugs come into your house, knocking your door down, arresting you just because they have to meet some quotas and throw you in the gulag, right? You don't have that many, probably none really, or very marginal amounts of neighbors or informers, right? During the Soviet Union, one in every four people were informers. Even in your own household, you have to be careful of what you said, right? This is kind of the telescreen that Orwell was talking about in a technological form, right? Back then it was in the human form as informers, right? Now we have it in our pocket, right? Or we have it in our kitchen as Alexa, right? As an echo who's always listening, right?
Mm.
Despite what they may say. We have good reason to believe that it is collecting that kind of data for recommender systems. It's not like we have to be very clear, like even for something like Amazon, it's not like you have a group of individuals just sitting and listening to everybody's conversations just for the hell of it. Now,
Mhm.
Snowden said that they actually did do some of that, right? And humans will be humans, and even at the NSA during those years, and probably still now, some people with their pettiness, would let me check up on an ex, right? Let's see what they're talking to. Let's get into their DMs, right? Their Facebook messages. So there's always going to be that. But I think that's more of an exception than the rule. But that is, of course, absolutely no excuse for what has been going on and what is, of course, still going on. Despite what Snowden has revealed, can you say you've seen substantial change, public change, either within the citizenry or at the political level to actually rein in what intelligence organizations like the NSA, and then that, of course, that's the one we know of course.
They kind of just stopped talking about it.
Yeah, they just kind of stopped talking. We kind of stopped talking about Snowden too, right? No pardon, nothing like that. Just continues to live in exile, right? So it's kind of the Moses principle, right? After a certain amount of time, certain amount of generations pass, you just forget about it, and we go back to normal. We live on this 24-hour news cycle where things change. The next expose comes out of, I don't know, whatever Trump used to tweet, right? And we would forget about what happened yesterday. And despite the grandiosity of what Snowden, you know, what Snowden showed us and what he continues to try to promote, either doing large media shows like Joe Rogan, which is fundamentally the largest show in the world, right? From raw numbers, is that, despite what's going on, it doesn't really seem that people, and when I mean people, I mean like large swaths of the population that are directly affected by these kinds of practices from the intelligence community. Um, they just don't really care, and that's the victory of the soft totalitarianism. You don't need those overtly coercive, violent measures in order to obtain information and therefore control. There's another way. And they've somehow designed technologies in such a way that make them so attractive that we're voluntarily willing to give up that information and happily post it, happily provide it in exchange for this amazing service. Whereas I think, perhaps Stalin at one time, if he knew of this possibility, this would have been the best of all possible worlds for achieving, that total state, right? The totalitarian state. He failed in a certain essence to do that, right? And we've shown that there are forms of totalitarianism that actually do work. We're living in
it. Yeah, I mean, it's sneaky, right? I mean, it's not in your face. I mean, if it was hard totalitarianism, people would rebel immediately, right? But with this, I mean, you get a little bit of a prize, right? You get a snack. I mean, it's kind of a Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, he feared the most that we would have so much information that we wouldn't want to even look into it. We wouldn't even be interested in it. And George Orwell, he feared that we wouldn't be allowed to we wouldn't have any information because the government would be taking away and censoring everything. But now it's kind of more of the Brave New World situation where we have all this information and we're just getting fed by it all the time, and we're voluntarily, happily playing along with everything that's going on, right?
Well, yeah, you see a little bit of both, don't you? You see the recommender systems, you see the practices of, Amazon's AWS, for example, removing Parler. That's one way of removing certain types of information or groups of people who perhaps are also siloed within their own, I guess you could say, dogma. But you're seeing the continual stratification between ideas and the groups of people who adhere to those ideas, right? So there's this unimaginable quantity of information. Then that information seems to be at least ideologically siphoned or filtered through different, I guess you could say, different spectrums of different ideologies. And then that large quantity of those specific filter types of ideologies are fed to those who are already predisposed or have a propensity towards the belief in those ideas. And therefore, you get a certain type of radicalization of the people who believe in certain things already, believe them even more because of these unimaginable quantities of data that focus just on that. This huge amount of confirmation bias that's then fed directly towards those who already have a propensity towards those ideas. And then the information that would be contrary to those ideas is filtered away and shifted towards those who have a propensity towards those ideas as being true. So you got once again, the best of both worlds there. You have the unimaginable quantities of data, but also the system is designed in such a way where the data that would conflict with your preconceived notions of what is true and not true is filtered away from you. So you have the large data, but also the siloed data, right? Siloed information. You have both the 1984 and Brave New World.
Yeah, it's kind of a mixture between, because, we have this awesome, positive society. Not a whole lot of people are dying. or at least not as much as
The West is a
before, right?
victory. It is
Yeah.
a victory. Doesn't mean it's
Mm-hmm.
perfect,
Mm-hmm.
right? You still see imperialism at its finest, probably at its height,
Yes.
really. A
Yeah.
soft imperialism, once again, right? You don't have the British Navy going everywhere, really, and imposing what you would call overt colonialism, right? But the United States does have military bases in almost every country, right? They
Mm-hmm.
have global influence. They have the petrodollar, right? They're the world's reserve currency. They can flex their muscles. Maybe they should. I don't know, right? I don't think they should be probably starting 10 regime change wars, right? That we don't even know why that they're fighting, right? You ask any
Yeah.
citizen, why are you in this country? Choose one. I don't know, right? Yeah, they don't really even know, but it just is what it is. It's kind of like a natural consequence of what's going on. So, of course, there's all these problems, right? Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. Great, right? It's a first world country, the richest country in the history of the world, right? The most powerful military in the history of the world. Rome could have only dreamed of that kind of hegemony, but a small town still can't get clean drinking water, right? So we do have problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great victory, low mortality rates, right? Um, okay, well, maybe the increase in IQ over the last 100 years, there's a general trend. You can say that if you take the stability and the veracity of intelligence quotient to be stable, has increased, but of course, in certain areas, decreases because of environmental factors and social factors. Lots of problems, definitely. Overall, I think a great victory.
Yeah. It's just, there's a lot of problems for sure. And hopefully we can fix it over time. But I mean, I'm a little pessimistic about the AI and ethics and whatnot, like you said, with Google and them firing people that speak out, right? The whistleblowers. But I'm also optimistic in the sense that I know we'll keep getting better and better technologies, and life will possibly get better, but I'm not 100% sure if the quality of life will improve.
See, that's a very interesting distinction with a big difference, right? There's a difference between life, right? Which, how can you measure that? Maybe just in years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Life expectancy. Life expectancy has gone up, continues to go up, right? Maybe you could consider that a net gain, right? We can probably all agree that more life is better than less, right?
Mm-hmm.
Particularly if we take into account the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what the life expectancy was in comparison to now, it's unequivocally significantly higher, right? And that's on account of what we would consider the successes of the West. And the West is not, I'm not talking about the geographic West. I'm talking about the West in terms of the political and economic values of what constitutes the West. So, like Japan would be considered the West, right? Australia and New Zealand are the West, despite not being geographically West. So I'm using West in that term, in those terms. So of course, technology has been a fundamental factor in what we would call the success of the West, right? And it's also a fundamental factor in the global South in bringing them out of poverty. And of course, in the East now, in China, China is one of the first countries, probably the first country that in a single generation has brought what was the majority of the population into poverty. Now, apparently, if we take what they say to be true as true, there is no poverty in China anymore. In a single generation, they managed to bring an entire country from what was essentially poverty into the middle class. That is also a success. At what cost? I do not know. Were those people who constitute the population of China happily or voluntarily willing to make the sacrifice towards what we consider, even in the West, as a beneficial end, more life, being in the middle class? Perhaps most people, I think most people would agree, is better than being in the poor class, the lower class. I think most people would agree that. So obviously but of course they take a more consequentialist approach towards these ends. And it seems that perhaps the West is also trending towards this more consequential cost benefit analysis of doing things, right? More information is better than less at all costs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Global hegemony at all costs, right? Military, economic, whatever it may be. Um, Nothing can bring down the West other than the West. Just like in the East, the only countries that can really bring them down is themselves. What we do as a matter of policy is what determines our future. Just like the decisions we make about how we design technologies today fundamentally support and constrain the types of technologies that are open to us in the future. Uh, Only we ourselves are capable of breaking the system, right? Of breaking the success. And we don't want to be defeated in our success. We don't want our success to be our defeat, right? To become complacent, to just accept, right? Towards whatever tendency happens to be in fashion.
I don't think it's possible to, I mean, it's possible to become complacent, but not over a long period of time, because I think people have a natural drive to continue to improve.
I think that would probably a good way of touching on perhaps what you would call human nature, whatever that may be, whether there's a universal human nature. I personally think that there is certain things that would be universal to all humans.
Well, life in general grows, you know, it doesn't, it tends towards growth, not decay.
So yes, I don't think anybody consciously moves towards decay, that's for sure. Of course, we do see historical examples of stagnation, or what we would call entropy, right? The natural path towards ever greater entropy, which is not in itself a bad thing either. Um, and of course, even as a matter of policy, we want to continue growth. In fact, the West has been predicated on this growth at all costs, right? Continue to grow. That's like our economies, the Western economies, particularly that of the United States, is extremely powerful for that reason. And this pandemic is kind of one of the things that can prove to be ultimately destructive to it, because it simply was not designed for this type of total halt, right? It's growth at all cost, right? And that way you can't just throw, a spear into the cogs, right? And not expect things to come apart. It's just, it wasn't built for that. It wasn't built with the safety nets that, for example, other Western countries like Europe, for example, have a lot of safety nets, but that comes at a cost. It's a slower growing economy, right? It's kind of more, it just steady along, right? More airbags, right? Whereas the United States, the American economy is extremely powerful, extremely potent, but it was not meant to stop. It was definitely not even meant to slow down. It's meant to keep growing, right? But in terms of your particular point on the complacency over time, we do see that, of course, in historical examples, even in the Soviet Union, right? It seemed like the complacency just got to a certain point where even in the 70s and 80s, the Soviet Union really started to liberalize, started to open up. They just couldn't maintain that kind of control. The Gulag Archipelago was falling apart. It was becoming saturated, right? It wasn't a sustainable, that type of planned economy simply was not sustainable, right? And eventually we saw in 1991 what happened, right? And that came at a cost, but Russia did bounce back despite what's happening now, right? Into what we would call a more liberalized, flourishing economy despite its own internal issues.
Yeah, I don't know if there's this Netflix documentary called, I think it's called Spyware. And it was just talking about all the times that Putin's assassinated someone.
Well, you know what? I hate playing the double, like the double standard game. All the world leaders are fundamentally assassins, murderers.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I don't even like it when one world leader calls another one out for that kind of behavior, particularly when that world leader probably has done more of that exact behavior. So it kind of seems like a type of, first of all, it's gaslighting, and second of all, it's a primal form of virtual signaling, and it's not even true. So like we just have to be very conscious about who our leaders are and who our politicians are and
Yeah.
the people they work with and what they do overseas, right? So it just is what it is. So, calling out Putin for being a bully, uh, gangster, they call it a mafia state. It's like, okay, and are you acting really any differently? Substantively, are you acting any
Yeah.
differently? No. You could bring up probably numerous examples of the last 4 presidents of the United States that have done substantially more egregious things. Substantially more egregious
Mm.
things.
No, I agree with you. It's kind of just it's just a mess, really.
Yeah, well, it fundamentally is. If we want to stay on this topic, for example, right? Let's make it very clear. Has Putin killed people? Yeah, most likely. I would probably say certainly. Okay. Obama dropped more bombs in the Middle East that they ran out of bombs. They ran out of bombs. They had to order more. Okay. He built the cages at the border that Trump put them in, put the kids in. Okay. He built those cages. Okay. He gaslighted the citizens of Flint, Michigan, right? That did not give them clean water, did not fix the problem. He made the banks bigger after the 2008 recession while kicking 5.1 million families out of their homes, right? During an economic recession, the greatest recession in North American history. Okay. So then then Trump comes along and he's, a clown and a show and tweets constantly. And every day is just something new. You can't even remember what happened yesterday. Right. And then now that Joe Biden wins, everything's great, right? Everything's back to normal. Everybody goes back to sleep, right? Because fundamentally, as Joe Biden did say when he spoke to the banks, right, nothing will fundamentally change, which means neoliberalism will continue as it was, because we can't have a president, meaning his predecessor, who was just saying in front of the cameras the bad things that we all do. Trump wasn't any different than his predecessor or his successor. His problem was that he kept saying the things that he was doing. You're not supposed to say those things. You just do them. Okay? That's the issue. They all do the same things. They're all the same fundamentally, right? So, after killing, over 1 million Iraqis in what is fundamentally a war that was started on false premises, right? To then call out, another world leader for being a gangster. It's, well, maybe you shouldn't have military bases in every single country in the world before you call somebody else a bully.
Yeah, I think Putin said somewhere along the lines like it takes one to know one.
To no one. And I probably in that moment could not have thought of something more true. It takes one to know one.
Yeah, well, at least Putin acknowledged, yeah, I'm a murderer.
Well, maybe Putin has a little bit of self-awareness,
Mm-hmm.
To be able to say that. And of course, he is that, and he has no fear, I guess you could say, in saying that. Perhaps if Joe Biden, for example, said, I kill people, that in the West perhaps would not go over well, despite substantively being that. You just don't say it, right? That's the difference. Don't say it, on public TV.
So I was wondering something that I've been confused about lately. Who is
Yeah.
Julian Assange?
Julian Assange is he is now an Australian journalist who was the proprietor of WikiLeaks, right? And he was the one with Chelsea Manning, who was a military personnel who was also a whistleblower that provided many documents to WikiLeaks on the fundamental torture programs that the U.S. was undertaking in the Middle East. So once again, let's perhaps not call out other countries for doing what are fundamentally war crimes and crimes against humanity, and look at what's being done by our own states. The United States, despite him not being an American citizen, wants to prosecute him for treason, despite you can't prosecute a foreign national for treason against the country you're not a citizen of. He was in exile, in asylum in South America, in an embassy. Now, I can't remember if it was the Bolivian embassy or one of those embassies, and has, after more than 6 years, I believe, has been brought to England for trial. The United States requested extradition to have him tried in the United States, where he probably would be tortured and killed. But the British government decided not to send them, to deny the request, because they fear for his life if he was sent to the United States. So that just says something also. because they do
Mm.
not agree with the American penal process of how they treat or how they suspect he will be treated in the American system. So things are in limbo. There are protests going on for his release, that he was following standard journalistic practices. He fundamentally exposed many high ranking US officials of crimes, of war crimes, and is being, I guess you could say, he's being punished for it. And he has been punished for it given the last few years of his life, what he's had to go through, essentially in exile and in asylum.
I mean, yeah, he's essentially spent 6 years in prison.
He essentially spent 6 years, yeah, in solitary confinement because he was under constant surveillance. If
Hmm.
he ever left the embassy, he would have been taken. That's without a doubt.
Wow. So I was looking into your profile on Phil People,
Okay.
and I noticed that you have done some work with autonomous weapons, or at least with the ethics of autonomous weapons. And I
Yep.
kind of want to hear
Yep.
about that for a little bit before we go.
Yeah, cool. So that's primarily my doctoral work. I published a bit on that, some forthcoming works on it also. So autonomous weapon systems, we can just call them colloquially, and they're called the killer robots, right?
Hmm.
Fundamentally, and they come in many different, shapes and sizes. They can be in the form of aerial autonomous weapons, like fully autonomous Reaper drones, for example, right? But I think when we talk about autonomous weapons, the first thing that comes to people's minds is the Terminator, right? It's like
Hmm.
these ground-based, humanoid, machine gun wielding type of killer robots. So there's been a long-standing debate over the last decade because we're seeing this trend of continued automation, right? And the continual application of artificial intelligence. We see a lot of this coming from the military, and that's no surprise. The military has always been at the forefront of technological innovation, not just the business world. And that's because, aside from the large amounts of funding, there's always a first strike incentive to have uh, the, the foremost technology, right? An arms race, essentially. Artificial intelligence is no different. In fact, even Putin himself, if we want to bring it back, said that the one who creates artificial general intelligence first will fundamentally have global hegemony, right? Just
Hmm.
the nature of the technology itself. It has the potential of being so powerful. So, of course, the military being the military, right? And it makes sense, is how can we continue this trend of automation? For example, just from the Bush years to the Obama years, we saw an over 100% increase in the use of drones rather than boots on the ground, right? Makes sense. It's economical. You don't risk anybody's lives, right? You have a low chance of getting caught, particularly when you do things over other countries' sovereign territory. You don't know where it comes from, and it could be stealthy, right? So we have a bunch of different things, right? Despite, of course, we know stories now of drone pilots having PTSD and so on. So they're not like totally separated from
Hmm.
some of the psychological consequences, like their peers who would be boots on the ground in the battlefield, right?
Hmm.
So it's how can we push this even further? It's like we have drone pilots now. That means we're expending manpower to train them, right? To sit down and make judgment calls, release fire, and so on. It's let's make this process fully autonomous, meaning can we imbue certain technologies, armed technologies, to be fully autonomous? What does that mean? They can select, that means recognize and select, and engage a target, right? Without any human intervention, all on their own.
I don't think that's a good idea.
Okay, so very good. So I think that when we're talking about things like that, it's like, okay, let's just take a little step back. Okay. So I personally, in my research, I disagree with the campaign to ban killer robots. It's a big campaign. It's like we got to ban any weapon that can autonomously select and engage a target. Okay, so my research has primarily focused on a more contextual view. I said that's a
Hmm.
very broad brushed, and I don't like these broad brush, generalized, right, universal type of
Hmm.
prohibitions. Right, there are examples where this may not be the case. Right, where we
Okay.
could probably have them and still develop them what you say ethically. But whenever we're talking about autonomous weapons, we have to be very clear. We're designing for death.
Mhm.
That's what it is. We're designing for death. So we can't, sugarcoat it, talk about neutralizing targets. We're killing people. That's what it's about. And that's what war fundamentally entails. But that doesn't mean war is wanton, damage, recalcitrance, whatever. Maybe we have laws of armed conflict and we have international humanitarian law, and therefore we have rules of engagement. You can't just do whatever you want. Okay. So the campaign to ban killer robots fundamentally is premised on that definition of what is an autonomous weapon system. Anything that can select and engage a target without human intervention. I argue that that may not always be the case, and that's because the military itself, based on how it's designed and how it operates, is fundamentally predicated on international humanitarian law and the laws of armed conflict in such a way is that most of the people who, exactly like when I described it to you, said it's not a great idea. And in fact, that doesn't, just because I say that there's ways forward doesn't mean that we should just, let's just make them and deploy them, right? And actually, one of the senior naval acquisitions officers at the Pentagon, his name escapes me now, says that we should pursue them at all costs, right? And I'm like, okay, well, that's the opposite, right? You have the ban all of them, then you're like, let's pursue it at all costs. Both bad, I think bad. I say don't ban them because, first of all, the United States often doesn't even sign on to international treaties. For example, they still deploy landmines despite them being prohibited by international law. They just didn't sign on to the treaty, right? It's, for them, overly coercive. So they didn't sign on. So it had the opposite effect of what the law wanted. I go, okay, I don't want to risk that. We ban them just broad brushed like that, then it's most likely that those who are probably already developing them will most likely not sign on to it, and therefore there'll be no law regulating these types of technologies, right?
Yeah, and the people that don't have them won't have they'll be left defenseless when we develop it, right?
Well, that's the risk of like the arms race, right? So and there's always that a little bit of that arms race going on, China, Russia, the United States, looking to always one up each other in terms of their military capabilities when it comes to technologies. So I don't like the broad brush ban because I think it risks doing more harm than good. We want everybody signing on to regulation of these systems because we see they're potentially dangerous. If we ban everything, it's most likely those who are already developing this won't even sign on at all, and then there won't be any of that regulation to govern those. So we want them to be sufficiently encompassing, but enough to allow for innovation to take place and sufficiently lenient enough that allows them to be developed, but in certain cases, right? And I don't like the other side, which is like, let's just develop them at all costs. Like that may be the consequence of a full-out ban. I say that the military already has processes in place that kind of govern how arms and technologies are used. First of all, an autonomous killer robot, despite which one you're thinking of, you could think of the Terminator one, it could be a naval or submersible, it could be an aerial technology, and we have more reason to believe it'll be an aerial technology, aside from the fact that aerial weaponry is a force multiplier, and we've seen that throughout the years. The United States, for example, being one of the countries that is mostly in conflicts around the world, there's a tendency, a trend towards further and further aerial engagements rather than boots on the ground, right? That's the whole point. We want to take boots off the ground, right? When developing this type of automation, we want to get them out of conflict. We don't want to risk lives. That's always been the philosophy, right? And it's more cost effective. So we have more reason to think when we're talking about killer robots, they'll most likely be aerial, right? Like fully autonomous drones. So no drone picks up, decides to go on a mission, and drops a bomb and comes back. That's just not how it works. Just like no soldier decides one day, I'm going to get up and just go and just start a mission. I'm going to go and kill a bunch of high value targets just because I decided that. There is no fully autonomous weapon, just like there's no fully autonomous soldier, marine, or seaman. That's because the military, as a structure itself, already constrains the autonomy of those that form part of it. So there's already an entire procedure before even a drone strike takes place, right? You have the entire briefing in which legal experts and commanders look at the battlefield itself, determine the proportionality assessments. Is this target worth the potential collateral damage that can take place? Okay, yes. Which armaments are we going to use? You're not going to drop a JDAM, right? Or a Moab, right? Like a small nuclear warhead to take out one target in a village, right? No. So there's weaponeering assessments that take place. It's like, which weapons are best suited for this job, right? We don't want to drop a nuke because that obviously will, yes, we eliminated our target, but we also eliminated half a country, right? So the proportionality assessment would be off, right? And there's too much collateral damage. It's no longer really collateral anymore, right? It's a war crime. So there's this entire pre-briefing that takes place. Then they would inform, for example, the pilot, right? It's like, here's your target. When you arrive at these GPS coordinates, you are allowed to release your warhead, right? And this could even take place in stormy weather, for example. So they don't even see the target, right? They just get to their assigned GPS coordinates. They go, I'm in the weapons envelope. I release my weapon and I go home. Can you find any point in where a human pilot is actually necessary there that cannot be simply substituted with a fully autonomous system that substantively changes the example there? The pilot in this case is fundamentally just an instrument for getting the plane to the weapons envelope and dropping the warhead. They often and cannot simply technically see the target they're even engaging with, because in many cases they do it in inclement weather, right? They could be above the cloud altitude. They know based on their GPS coordinates, here it is. The GPS guided bomb goes to its predetermined target, right? All they have to do is get to the position, click the button, and then go back home. You can simply substitute that even with a fully autonomous system. And in fact, the fully autonomous system may be even more capable of recognizing the target through inclement weather based on the types of sensors that it uses and so on, and their ability to recognize the target and to be more precise in guiding its missile, whereas a human cannot, right? So you can directly substitute what we're already doing with a fully autonomous system and not substantively change our practices, because they are already guided by international law that determines what happens before a mission even takes place. You see? So that system could be able to select and engage a target autonomously, but we have to get rid of this idea of autonomy of a system the way we would think about human autonomy as this type of self-consciousness, right? That's not what it actually means. So that's why I disagree with that definition of what types of systems should be banned. And I also disagree with the, innovate at all costs, screw it, first strike initiative. We develop it first, we have asymmetric, advantage. No, I'm all about, the middle road is either side has deleterious and potentially recalcitrant consequences that will lead to more harm than good. But there is a middle path, and that's done through proper understanding of how military operations take place and proper design of technologies that is fundamentally predicated on designers working directly with military personnel.
I guess there's always a commander. And with the killer robots, right, they can, like you said, perhaps sometimes be better at picking the right target, right? They might be better at reducing critical damage, right? Or what's the word?
Collateral damage.
Collateral damage, sorry. And with that, it could be more ethical, right? It could be better. We could improve because we're not killing people that shouldn't be killed.
Yeah, there's always going to be issues with that. A colleague of mine, Nathan Wood, for example, he wrote a great paper on this. He said that if a killer robot, and this can go for any type of killer robot, but primarily for ground-based ones, a lot of scholars in the field over the last decade have said exactly what you said. It's like, theoretically at least, right? We can arrive at a point where the technology allows a killer robot, an autonomous weapon, to be more precise, faster, to be able to recognize more efficiently, and to coordinate amongst themselves, right, targets, right? And therefore, they could be more ethical. But at that point, the moment they are capable of being so precise, so fast, so capable, they therefore can no longer legally be lethal. Because if you can be so fast, so precise, uh, and so efficient by international law, if you can do that lethally by international law, you should not use lethal force. Because if you can be so quick and so efficient, you should use non-lethal measures to take down an opponent. Because given the choice, right? If you are equally capable, given the strength of the opponent, capabilities of the opponent, of using either lethal or non-lethal force to arrive at the same ends, you must use non-lethal force. Else, it contravenes the laws of armed conflict, right? So there's almost like a threshold. It's like they can get as good as humans, but the moment they start getting too good, then they are by definition, by legal definition of international laws of armed conflict, they should not be able to have lethal capabilities any longer. They should be able to effect the same casualty to neutralize the target, but by non-lethal means. Now, of course, we can see some of these difficulties, for example, with aerial, especially high altitude based weapons. How can you really neutralize a target with a non-lethal bomb, for example, right? Or to take out a bunker, right? That would be difficult. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule, and that's exactly my point. Is that we can't have these all-encompassing, broad-brushed, universalized, generalized conditions for a ban. We must ban all systems that can select and engage the targets without human interference or involvement. That is way too broad. And that risks doing the exact opposite of what it intends to do for the exact reasons we just mentioned.
Wow. Well, I think that wraps things up.
That was super fun.
Yeah, that was awesome. You're a really interesting guy to talk to. Thanks for coming on.
No problem, man. Thank you for inviting me.
Do you have anything else you'd like to leave us off with?
Not really, other than if anybody wants to be bored by some of the papers that I write, they can probably follow me on Twitter, or don't follow me on Instagram, please. Just follow. You can follow me on Twitter, and of course you can find me on Google and all that kind of stuff.
Well, don't cut yourself short. I'm sure they're not boring.
Thank you, brother.
So if anyone has any questions, just email into.the.absurd.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.